front-loaded a tremendous market rally starting in 2009, in March of 2009. We made a decision back in 2008, early 2009. We were going to have a wealth effect. That was achieved. We made wealthy people wealthier. But the point is it didn't trickle down, and we have taken away a lot of the ability of consumers to use their savings to spend.
The policy he described has continued. It's accelerated. And right now, today, it's costing you over $1 trillion a year in taxes. This is the story of exactly how that works and who, specifically, benefits.
Fisher wasn't a whistleblower.
He wasn't a dissident. He was an architect describing his own work. 10 years as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. He sat in the room. He voted on the policy. And in January 2016, on live television, he described what it actually did. In 2026, the United States government pays $1,045 billion in annual interest on its publicly held debt. That number, from Treasury.gov, updated daily, available to anyone, is larger than the entire discretionary defense budget.
Larger than Medicare?
It flows automatically. Before Congress votes on a single appropriation, before a road is repaired, before a school receives $1 of federal funding. Fisher said the gas tank of the wealthy was filled. Before this video ends, we're going to name the exact institutions and mechanisms that received that fuel and quantify precisely how much they got. Over $1 trillion flows out of US tax revenue annually as interest payments. The question almost nobody asks at the dinner table: who is on the receiving end? We're going to answer that with Treasury's own published data. By name, by amount, by mechanism. Look, $1,045 billion. Written out in full, $1,045 million. Stacked in $100 bills, that pile would rise 712 miles into the sky, past the International Space Station, into the thermosphere. That's $33,124 per second. As you're watching this, between 2007 and 2010, the exact years the Fed began its first round of quantitative easing, median American family net worth fell 38.8% in real terms, from $126,400 to $77,300. Goldman Sachs posted $13.39 billion in net earnings. In 2009, the same year. Don't explain that gap away yet. Just hold those two numbers in your head. They'll mean something different by the end. Before we can understand where this money flows, we have to get one thing right that most economics degrees get wrong. Where does money actually come from? The answer they taught you in school was technically made obsolete on a specific morning in March 2020. Nobody announced it. Here's the textbook explanation. A bank holds 10% of deposits in reserve. It lends out the other 90%. That loan becomes a deposit at another bank, which lends 90% of that, and so on. That's what most economists were trained on. That's what most textbooks still teach in 2026. Here's the actual mechanism. When a bank approves your mortgage, it doesn't lend you money sitting in a vault somewhere. It types the number into existence. The deposit is new money, created at the precise moment of loan approval. The Bank of England confirmed this in their 2014 quarterly bulletin. Their words: banks do not act simply as intermediaries, lending out deposits that savers place with them. Not a fringe theory, not heterodox economics. The institution that invented central banking published this in an official document 12 years ago. This mechanic isn't modern. The Bank of England has operated this way since 1694. 330 years of deposit creation. The textbook version, with the 10% reserve ratio, was always a simplification. What changed in 2020 is that the simplification became officially false. On March 26, 2020, buried inside COVID emergency announcements, the Federal Reserve eliminated all reserve requirements, dropped them to zero. The headlines were about ventilators and stimulus checks. The most significant change to monetary architecture in decades got 3 paragraphs in the Federal Register.
3 paragraphs.
Alongside a notice about updated bank examination schedules and a clarification on reporting forms.
If there's no reserve requirement,
What actually stops banks from creating unlimited money? We're going to answer that. And the answer involves a piece of lobbying that wrapped up 4 months ago.
here's what matters.
New money doesn't enter everyone's hands at the same time. It flows through the economy in a specific sequence. And your position in that sequence determines whether you beat inflation or get consumed by it.
This is not an accident.
It's a mechanism. It has a 300-year-old name.
But before we get to that name,
We have to get to the weekend, when the modern version of this system was built. Because it didn't happen gradually,
it happened in 3 days.
in a place called Camp David. And the people in that room understood at some level that the decision they made couldn't be undone.
August 13,
1971. Camp David, Maryland.
Nixon gathered 15 advisors.
No press corps, no State Department.
Henry Kissinger
Was deliberately excluded. The Secretary of State didn't know this meeting was happening.
Here's what was at stake.
Since 1944, the world's monetary system ran on a single promise. Every dollar was redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce.
Any nation holding dollars
Could walk up to the US gold window and demand physical gold in exchange. This wasn't theoretical, it was contractual. By 1965, Charles de Gaulle was systematically converting French dollar reserves to gold. He sent a French naval vessel to collect it from the New York Federal Reserve.
de Gaulle understood the math.
The US was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. Between 1959 and 1971, US gold reserves dropped from $21.7 billion to $10.2 billion. The vault was draining.
The Vietnam War
Was costing $25 billion annually. That money had to come from somewhere. And it was coming, indirectly, out of the gold window.
Fed Chairman Arthur Burns
Argued vigorously against closing the gold window at Camp David. He reportedly warned that Pravda would write it as the collapse of capitalism.
Connolly overruled him.
The argument lasted 2 days.
2 days later,
Nixon on television, 17 minutes. He used the word temporary twice.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
That was August 15, 1971. That was 53 years ago. Allied central banks in Germany, France, and Japan received notification hours before the speech. Not days, hours.
Connolly told European finance ministers,
The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. He wasn't being impolitic. That was the policy. Here's what nobody's saying.
the Smithsonian Agreement,
Nixon's attempted temporary fix collapsed within 15 months. By March 1973, the entire world was on floating exchange rates. Permanent.
every dollar in your wallet,
Is now backed by exactly one thing. The promise that the US government will keep paying its bills. And as of 2026, it pays those bills by borrowing at $1 trillion in annual interest.
but here's the historical parallel most people miss
Entirely. In 1933, the government confiscated privately held gold at $20.67 an ounce,
then repriced it to $35.
6 months later. A 69% instant profit, funded by forced transfer from private citizens to the state. They called it a stabilization measure.
In 2008,
They did something structurally identical. But instead of physical gold, they took purchasing power. And there was nothing physical to surrender, so the transfer happened silently.
Nixon called this
Temporary. Burns's own diary entries suggest he understood it was likely permanent from the beginning. Before this video ends, we'll show you what the Camp David calculations actually reveal about what the architects knew.
the gold standard is gone.
Reserve requirements are gone. And now, there's a name for what happens next. An 18th century French banker figured it out 300 years before quantitative easing existed. He wrote it down with precise detail. And in July 2024, the Federal Reserve's own research division published a paper confirming he was right.
Richard Cantillon,
1730s, Irish-French banker. He published one book, Essai sur la nature du commerce en général, around 1730.
in it,
He described a mechanism that operates every time new money enters an economy. It reads like it was written last Tuesday.
new money doesn't raise all prices simultaneously.
It flows through the economy in sequence. The first recipients spend it at old prices.
By the time new money reaches wages,
The last stop, prices have already moved. The worker gets the inflation. The asset holder gets the appreciation.
between 2008
And 2022, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from $900 billion to $8.9 trillion. The S&P 500 gained over 900% in the same period.
real median household income
Grew roughly 14% over the same 14 years. Adjusted for actual inflation experienced by working households, closer to flat.
So, who filled their tanks?
Here's the specific answer. There are 24 institutions called primary dealers, the only entities legally permitted to transact directly with the Federal Reserve.
When the Fed conducts quantitative easing,
When it buys bonds, it buys them from these 24 banks first, at above market prices. The cash flows to them before it flows anywhere else. This is the Cantillon mechanism operating through institutional architecture.
Goldman Sachs
Posted $13.39 billion in net earnings in 2009. The year, median American family net worth fell 38.8%.
two numbers.
One policy period, no narration required.
Now, the $1.045 trillion question.
Who receives those interest payments? Treasury International Capital reports show foreign central banks hold $9.27 trillion of U.S. debt.
The Fed's own distributional financial accounts
Show the top 10% hold the overwhelming share of domestic bond holdings.
your federal tax dollars are,
By mechanical necessity, transferring income to the capital class at trillion-dollar annual scale. That is not an accusation, that is an accounting identity.
one interest payment line.
Larger than education, housing, transportation, and environmental protection combined, from the government's own published data.
In July 2024,
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York published a staff report. Public. Available to anyone. Its conclusion, in their own words,
QE
widened the income gap between the top 10% and the rest by raising profits and equity prices. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, July 2024.
Bernanke called it
The wealth effect. A necessary transmission mechanism, a means to an end.
same institution.
Opposite framing, 15 years apart. Which version do you believe? And why did it take 15 years to say the second one?
Andrew Hussar
Ran the QE1 bond buying program from inside the Fed. In 2013, he published a piece in the Wall Street Journal calling QE the greatest backdoor Wall Street bailout of all time. Thomas Honig voted no on every single Fed accommodation decision in 2010. 10 consecutive dissents. He warned of financial imbalances and excessive risk-taking. He was overruled 10 times. The New York Fed confirmed his predictions in 2024. Stop here for a second. You pay taxes. Those taxes fund the US government. Part of those operations is servicing $31.41 trillion in debt. That cost flows directly to whoever holds treasury bonds. If you don't hold treasury bonds in meaningful quantity, you are on the funding side of this transfer, not the receiving side. That's arithmetic, not ideology. The Congressional Budget Office projects this number more than doubles by 2036 to $2.1 trillion annually. Let's look at what that money isn't going to pay for. $2.1 trillion annually by 2036. At that point, more federal revenue flows to bondholders than to Social Security. More than Medicare. Social Security serves 72 million Americans. Medicare serves 66 million. The interest payment serves the bondholder class. The math doesn't lie about the priority ordering. What stops banks from creating unlimited money now that reserve requirements are gone? Capital requirements under Basel III, which in March 2026, after years of banking industry lobbying, regulators softened. They called it a regulatory reset. The last formal constraint, reserve requirements, was removed in 2020. Its replacement is now under negotiation. The guardrails aren't holding. They're being argued down in real time by the same institutions that benefit from the absence of constraint. Burns' diary entries show he warned Nixon about inflationary consequences before the Camp David decision. Connolly's "your problem" framing wasn't temporary diplomatic posturing. It was a governing philosophy with a 50-year shelf life. The Smithsonian Agreement collapsed in 15 months, not because it failed technically, but because once you remove the discipline of gold convertibility, no political mechanism exists to reimpose it. Nixon knew. Burns knew. The IMF projects US gross debt reaches 142% of GDP by 2031. Reinhardt and Rogoff's historical research identified 90% as the threshold where debt begins constraining economic growth. The US breached that 90% threshold in 2010. It hasn't been below it since. When governments reach this debt level, history offers 3 exits: outright default, hyperinflation, or financial repression, forcing savers into negative real interest rates, silently transferring purchasing power to the government to service the debt. The US is already in stage 3. Inflation-adjusted savings rates have been negative for multiple years. The transfer is happening. The mechanism is the interest rate differential. The official name for it is accommodation. The practical name is silent confiscation. No one hands over anything physical, so no one files a report. Look. Since 1975, $79 trillion has transferred from the bottom 90% of earners to the top 1%. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a non-partisan Rand Corporation analysis published in 2020. And now you understand the mechanism that made it possible. Here's what this means practically. Cantillon proximity, your position in the sequence of new money distribution, determines whether inflation works for you or against you. Assets closest to the money creation point benefit first. Real assets tend to hold value through inflation cycles. Cash savings held at nominal interest rates lose purchasing power silently, without a news cycle, without an announcement, without a headline. This isn't a system designed with malice toward any individual. It's an institutional architecture built over 112 years through crises and expedient decisions that happens to systematically transfer wealth from those farthest from new money creation to those closest.
We made wealthy people wealthier.
He said that knowing the data would confirm it. And now the Treasury publishes it daily. The NY Fed published a paper about it. The CBO projects it doubling by 2036.
The dollar in your pocket
Is a promise from a government paying $1 trillion a year just to keep making it.
The question isn't whether you trust the promise. The question is,
Who made the rules about who gets paid first, and who decided you wouldn't need to know?